It was a late November night in 1987, and Prague was already asleep. A faint mist hung over the city, softening even the glow of the street lamps. In a quiet apartment house in Vinohrady, a man named John sat at his kitchen table. He was 36, worked as a technician in a state company, and whenever he leaned back in his chair after a long day, he felt older than he really was. But it wasn't age that weighed on him. It was the feeling that his life could have been different. When he was young, he wanted to study history. He wanted to teach, write, and help people understand the world. But the only thing he managed to do was end up on a list of people who were politically unreliable. His uncle had emigrated to the United States after 1968, and Jan paid for it his entire life, even though he had nothing to do with it, even though he had been only 10 years old when it happened. Instead of university came work. Instead of freedom came caution. Instead of dreams came fear. The quiet, invisible kind that no one mentioned at home. But John still had something the regime could never take away: his family and his hope. His wife Ava worked in a library, and their 8-year-old daughter Marketa was curious, honest, always ready with another question she mustn't ask in front of strangers. Tonight, John was sitting here because he had a strange dream. A dream that one day he would live in a free country, that his daughter would study whatever she wished, and that people would be able to speak openly. When he woke up, the dream felt impossibly distant, and yet something about it stayed with him. 1988. Quiet changes in a quiet world. The streets looked the same, but something was shifting. At work, people whispered about Poland, about Hungary, about the small movements in the world beyond the borders, not fast, but real. Sometimes Jan saw young people putting up leaflets that disappeared the next day. He noticed that people in shops no longer lowered their voices as much when complaining about empty shelves. In the library where Ava worked, once forbidden books slowly moved from under the table to slightly higher shelves, though still cautiously. Everything felt fragile, like someone taking a breath but not yet daring to exhale. And Jan felt, from somewhere deep inside, that something was approaching, something that would break the stillness, something that would change the rhythm of the world. Autumn 1989, when the world inhaled. In September, Marketa started school. One morning, as Jan walked her there, he noticed the notebook in her hand. Inside was a drawing, a house, a sun, a tree, and letters she was learning to write. "Tati, why didn't you go to university?" she asked innocently. Jan had so many explanations prepared for adults, yet none of them worked for a child. He finally said only, "Because sometimes people who shouldn't be deciding decide for you." Marketa didn't understand, but Jan knew she would, one day, and he hoped no one in her generation would ever have to answer a similar question. November 17th, 1989, the day nothing and everything changed. It was a Friday after work. Jan sat at home listening to the radio while Ava cut apples for a pie. The news reports were cautious, but something was happening in Prague. A student march, a remembrance of November 17th, 1939. A gathering at Albertov. Jan felt a strange pressure in his chest, as if that old dream from 1987 had returned to him later in the evening when they heard fragments about the violent police crackdown on Narodnitsyda. Both he and Aoife froze. They hadn't been there, but they could have been. And worse, one day their daughter could live in a world where she, Jan, couldn't finish that thought. The two of them sat quietly for a long time, and for the first time in many years, Jan felt not only fear, but also something stronger, hope. Late 1989, how color returned to the world. The days that followed felt like waking up from a long sleep. Demonstrations on Wenceslas Square, ringing keys, people who had been silent for decades suddenly speaking aloud. Jan stood in the crowd, and no one told him he wasn't allowed to be there. He saw old people, young students, families with children. He saw fear, joy, tears, hope. When he lifted little Marketa to see the speakers on the Melantric balcony, she asked, "Tati, why do people hold keys?" He smiled. "To open the door to a better life." And for the first time, he felt he was saying not a comforting phrase, but the truth. 1 year later, 1990, the year dream settled into reality. The world changed faster than Jan could follow. He no longer had to speak quietly at home. He no longer had to be careful at work. He no longer had to stand in lines where people grumbled but never said anything out loud. Ava now handed out books freely. Books she once hid. Marketa's school books no longer mentioned brotherly help. And Jan? One February evening, he came home with a letter. It stated that he now had the opportunity to take supplementary exams and apply for the university studies that had once been denied to him. He sat at the same kitchen table where he had dreamed of freedom 3 years earlier, holding the letter in trembling hands. Ava smiled gently. "So?" she asked. Jan took a deep, calm, free breath. "So, yes, I'll do it." He already had a home, a job, a family, but now he had something more, the freedom to choose, and that is something that cannot be bought, taken, or erased. Conclusion. The dream that woke up later that year, as John slowly drifted to sleep, he heard the city outside. It wasn't perfect. It had a long road ahead, but it was different now, and he knew that the dream from 1987 had not been just a dream. It had been the first breath of a new future, a future where his daughter would live without fear, a future where she could study whatever she wished, a future built by people who decided they were no longer afraid. John slowly closed his eyes, and for the first time in many years he fell asleep, knowing that tomorrow would be better than today.